Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that might make you squirm a little in your seat. We're
Yeah.
tackling a topic that people don't usually like to talk about.
Yeah, it's not exactly a cheerful subject, is it?
It's ugliness.
Ugliness, exactly.
And it's not just about like what we find personally unattractive, right? We're going to be
Yeah.
like looking at how ugliness has been defined like across different societies and different time periods.
Yeah, and depicted too
Yeah,
through art and literature. How have people actually shown ugliness and what can we learn from that?
absolutely. And to help us navigate this maybe a slightly uncomfortable terrain, we're using Umberto Eco's book on ugliness
Great book.
as our guide.
Yeah.
We'll also be looking at some visuals
Yes.
to really bring this to life, like ancient masks, medieval paintings, even some modern literature.
Yeah, and get ready for some surprises.
Oh, yeah.
Because what one culture might see as monstrous, another might see as beautiful.
That's a good point.
And what was considered ugly in one era might be totally fascinating to us today. Okay, so speaking of like different perspectives, Eco actually lays out three basic types of ugliness in his book.
Okay.
And I think even these simple categories are going to make you think twice about what you find repulsive.
Interesting.
So the first one's pretty straightforward, something that physically disgusts, just like viscerally repulsive.
Like a rotten piece of fruit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or like, that carton of milk that's been in the back of the fridge for way too long.
Ooh, yeah.
But then the second type gets a little more interesting.
Okay.
It's about form and structure.
Right.
So it's something that's malformed or disharmonious. Like,
Oh.
think of a building with like mismatched proportions.
Yeah, it feels wrong.
Yeah, it just feels off.
Yeah.
And then there's the third type of ugliness. And this is where it gets really complex. And this is where like our own cultural and personal beliefs come into play.
Yeah.
Ugliness as like moral or aesthetic repulsion.
Right. So it's not just a visual thing.
Yeah.
It's loaded with meaning.
Exactly. And Eco makes this point in his introduction that this is especially important when we're looking at art from other cultures or other time periods.
Right, because our modern sense of beauty can totally make us misunderstand what we're seeing.
Exactly. And he uses Picasso's Woman Weeping as an example. A modern viewer might look at that painting and find the distorted features, kind of ugly or disturbing, but someone from another era might see beauty in its expressive power.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Beauty and ugliness, they're subjective,
Yeah.
always changing,
Yeah.
influenced by so many things, culture history, even our own personal experiences.
Yeah, and like we have an image here in the source material of an Ikoi dance mask from Nigeria.
Oh, yeah.
And it's got these powerful features and this really bold design. And, to someone who's not familiar with African art, it might be jarring at first glance.
Yeah, maybe even a little scary.
Yeah, maybe even ugly.
Right.
But in its cultural context, it probably represents something completely different.
Something beautiful and meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me think of what Voltaire wrote in his philosophical dictionary. He compares European standards of beauty with those of a Negro from Guinea.
Right, completely different.
Yeah, and it just shows how much perceptions can vary.
No one right way to see beauty or ugliness.
Exactly. Okay, so let's travel back in time for a minute to ancient Greece.
Okay.
Their concept of beauty was all about harmony and proportion.
Those classical ideals we see in their sculptures and architecture.
Right, like those perfectly sculpted figures of the Greek gods and goddesses.
Exactly. They embody that ideal.
Yeah.
And Plato went as far as to say that beauty was linked to moral goodness.
Wow.
Yeah. And Pausanias, the Greek writer and traveler, he really stressed the importance of proportion and symmetry in art.
But like all empires and all ideologies, this ideal eventually shifted, right?
It did.
During the decline of the Roman Empire, this new aesthetic emerged.
And Eco calls it the aesthetic of the measureless.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, it means basically the opposite of the classical ideal.
Okay. Instead of harmony and proportion, it's excess and disproportion.
So it's like you can see the Roman Empire crumbling in their art as things become more distorted and exaggerated.
Yeah, it's a fascinating shift.
Yeah.
And nowhere is it more evident than in those monstrous creatures that populate classical mythology.
Oh, yeah. We have a whole cast of characters here. The Chimera from Homer's Iliad.
A terrifying hybrid.
Yeah, the sirens from the Odyssey.
Alluring but deadly.
Yeah, and the harpies.
Grotesque figures representing chaos and disruption.
Yeah, and let's not forget those fearsome sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis.
Right, an impossible choice for sailors.
Yeah, and Polyphemus the Cyclops.
Single-eye savage nature.
Yeah, so these creatures weren't just like random scary stories, right?
No, they represented a fear of the unknown.
At the measureless.
Exactly, the potential for chaos to disrupt order and beauty.
And Waterhouse's painting, Ulysses and the Sirens,
Yeah.
really captures this, visually you can see the allure of danger and the grotesque beauty of these mythical creatures.
It's a powerful image. Yeah, okay, so let's shift gears for a minute and talk about another figure of ugliness,
Okay.
the devil.
Ah, yes, the embodiment of evil.
So in the Old Testament, he's more of a nebulous force.
Right, kind of an abstract concept.
But in the New Testament, he starts to take on a more concrete form.
And during the Middle Ages, his image gets even more monstrous.
As fear of him grew,
Exactly, his appearance reflects those anxieties.
it's like the more people feared him, the uglier he became.
And even Martin Luther was fascinated by the devil's physical form.
Really?
Yeah, he talked about the devil's ability to change size.
Interesting.
Yeah, so evil could manifest in so many ways.
Not just as a single image.
Exactly.
Okay, so, and then we have the Theatrum Diabolorum.
A 16th century demonology text.
Yeah, it's like a catalog of demons, each linked to a specific sin.
Pride, gambling, gluttony, you name it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they even had specific images for them.
So it's like ugliness was tied to sin.
Moral and aesthetic judgments all mixed together.
Wow. Okay, so speaking of things that are both repulsive and fascinating.
Oh, death. Yes, the ultimate ugliness for many.
Yeah, and the triumph of death was this really popular motif in medieval art and literature.
And it wasn't subtle.
No.
Like the dance macabre with death as a skeleton leading people to the grave.
Yeah, a stark reminder of mortality.
For everyone.
Yeah, and there's also that image from the Master of the Upper Rhine, the deceased lovers, the image of a young couple struck down in their prime. It's a pretty powerful meditation on mortality.
It is.
Yeah, and then, but for sheer scale and intensity, nothing beats Bruegel's 16th century painting, The Triumph of Death.
Oh, yeah. Skeletons everywhere, reaping souls.
It's okay.
A world turned upside down.
And this fascination with death and decay, it didn't end with the Middle Ages.
No, it continues today.
Yeah, like contemporary writers like Don DeLillo in Underworld and Sylvia Plath in her poem Two Views of a Cadaver.
They're still exploring these themes.
Yeah, it's fascinating how, across centuries, artists and writers have used ugliness to explore these fears and anxieties about mortality.
It's a universal human experience.
It is. Okay, but ugliness wasn't always about fear and darkness.
Right.
In the Middle Ages, it was also used for social commentary and even humor.
The medieval world ripe for satire.
Yeah, and ugliness plays a key role.
Like those carnival festivities with their grotesque masks and figures.
Yeah, we have some images of those in the source material. They're pretty wild.
Oh, yeah. Distorted faces, exaggerated body parts.
It's all about absurdity.
Exactly. And it was a way for people to escape social norms for a little while.
To mock those in power.
To turn the world upside down.
And then there's the Feast of Fools.
Oh, yes, where the lower clergy and commoners would take over the church.
Mocking rituals and hierarchies.
Using humor and ugliness to point out hypocrisy.
It's like they were using ugliness as a weapon.
In a way, yes.
And a great example of this is that 15th century poem, The Peasant's Fart.
Crude and graphic.
But with a sharp social critique underneath.
Exactly. Even the most ugly things can be used to make a point.
Okay, so let's move on to the Renaissance now.
A period of great change.
Yeah, and we see a real shift in attitudes toward ugliness, especially in the work of Rabelais.
His book, Gargantua and Pantagruel.
Yeah.
A celebration of the earthly and the corporeal.
So it's a real departure from the medieval fear of ugliness.
Absolutely. Rabelais embraces the human body in all its forms.
Imperfections and all.
Yes, a true liberation.
And this embrace of the grotesque wasn't just about shock value, right?
No, it was a way to challenge norms.
To question authority.
To celebrate the full spectrum of human experience.
Even the messy parts.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about caricature now.
An art form that really uses ugliness to make a statement.
Yeah, like think of Daumier and Gros.
Masters of distortion and exaggeration.
Yeah, and their work was biting satirical.
Definitely not afraid to make people uncomfortable.
And that's the power of caricature, right?
By highlighting and distorting features, it reveals deeper truths.
About people and society.
Precisely.
Okay, so speaking of highlighting features, let's talk about a more sensitive topic.
Okay.
Ugliness and the female form.
A long and complicated history.
Yeah, and there's this tradition of portraying women's ugliness, especially linked to aging.
Reflecting those anxieties about female aging and the pressure to be beautiful.
Yeah, and we see this in works by Dante, Shakespeare, Boccaccio, where old women are often depicted as these grotesque figures.
Symbols of decay and decline.
And then there are those poems of the Silver Lady from the 16th century.
With graphic and unsettling imagery
It's a reminder of how female aging has been viewed.
and the double standards women have faced.
But there were voices of resistance, too.
Yes, thankfully.
During the Renaissance, we see this wave of anti-blazon poetry emerging.
Challenging those traditional views.
Yeah, like poets like Hortensia Landi and Lucrezia Marinella.
That turn the tables.
Yeah, praising women's beauty and critiquing men's ugliness.
This is a real shift.
Yeah, a rejection of the male gaze.
Exactly.
And this shift coincided with a broader reassessment of ugliness during the Mannerist and Baroque periods.
A new kind of exploration.
Yeah, like Michelangelo and Grippius, they wrote poems reflecting on aging decay and the inevitability of death,
It wasn't about fearing ugliness.
but acknowledging it as a part of life.
Exactly.
And even the devil gets a makeover during this time.
He becomes more subtle, more intellectual.
Less about physical ugliness and more about inner darkness.
A fascinating evolution.
Yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 20th century now.
Modern world.
And the emergence of this concept of the uncanny.
The blurring of lines between the familiar and the strange.
The beautiful and the ugly.
A feeling of unease.
Yeah, like those grotesque figures in Goldfinger.
Nadja with his steel-rimmed hat.
Yeah, and that shape-shifting thing in John W. Campbell Jr.'s story.
Violating our understanding of biology.
Yeah, they tap into our anxieties about the unknown.
The potential for the familiar to become monstrous.
And what's interesting is how these figures, while being considered ugly, they still manage to captivate us.
That's the power of ugliness.
Yeah, it provokes us.
It challenges us.
It makes us question our assumptions.
About the world and our place in it.
So we've traveled through centuries of art, literature, mythology, exploring how ugliness has been defined and depicted and used to express all these different emotions and ideas.
A fascinating journey.
It is, and we've seen how its meaning has shifted and evolved.
And how it continues to fascinate and disturb us today.
But this is just the beginning of our deep dive.
We have much more to uncover.
So stay with us as we continue exploring this multifaceted world of ugliness and its impact on human experience. Welcome back to our exploration of ugliness.
Glad to be back.
I'm still thinking about how subjective it can be. You know, like those African masks we talked about?
Yeah.
Beautiful to some and maybe a bit scary to others.
It really shows how much our own background shapes what we find appealing or repulsive.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's go back to ancient Greece for a second. We talked about their ideal of beauty, you know, harmony and proportion.
Right.
But how did they actually depict ugliness in humans?
Yeah, because it wasn't all just mythological creatures.
Exactly.
Well, in ancient Greece, ugliness in humans was often linked to that same idea of a lack of harmony and proportion.
Okay, so if someone didn't fit that ideal form, they might be considered ugly.
Right, and it wasn't just about physical appearance either.
Right.
It could also be about a person's character.
Okay.
Like if someone was considered to be excessive in their behavior or lacked moderation.
So it's an inner thing, too.
Yeah, it's like they saw beauty and ugliness as reflections of inner harmony or disharmony.
Interesting. Okay, so how does that tie into that aesthetic of the measureless
Yeah.
that emerged later on?
Yes, during the decline of the Roman Empire.
Right.
Well, that aesthetic really challenged those classical ideals.
It was all about embracing excess and disproportion and the strange.
Yeah, a complete rejection of that Greek pursuit of perfection.
And we see this in the art of the time, right?
Absolutely. You see a move away from those idealized forms of classical art towards a more expressive, often grotesque style.
It's like you can see the anxieties of the late Roman Empire reflected in their art.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears again now and talk about the Middle Ages.
Okay.
And this very specific fear that was prevalent then, the fear of the devil and hell.
Things get pretty dark here.
Yeah, fire and brimstone demons, eternal torment, the whole medieval nightmare.
Yeah, the medieval imagination was really fixated on hell.
And the horrors that awaited sinners.
Exactly. And this fear is really vividly expressed in the art and literature of the time.
So how did they depict hell? What did it look like?
Well, imagine like a fiery abyss filled with these grotesque demons tormenting souls for all eternity.
It's like a vision designed to scare people into being good.
Exactly. A warning against straying from the path of righteousness.
And the devil himself, how was he portrayed?
Oh, he was often shown as this monstrous figure with horns and claws and a terrifying face.
The embodiment of evil.
Exactly the tempter who lured souls to their damnation.
We have some really vivid descriptions of hell in our source material.
Oh yeah, like that one from St. Brendan's 10th century voyage,
Yeah.
with that monstrous blacksmith forging instruments of torture.
It's a pretty powerful image.
It really highlights that medieval focus on the physical reality of suffering.
And then, of course, there's Dante's Inferno.
The ultimate guidebook to hell.
Yeah, taking us through all 9 circles.
Each with its own unique punishments.
It's amazing how these depictions still resonate with us today.
Yeah, they tap into some primal fears.
About punishment and the unknown.
Absolutely.
Okay. But ugliness wasn't always used to evoke fear and dread, right?
Right.
It also played a role in humor and social satire during the Middle Ages.
Yeah, things get a bit more lighthearted here.
Okay, so tell me about this.
Well, the medieval world had this real embrace of what we might call grotesque comedy.
Grotesque comedy.
Yeah, it's often dark and absurd,
Mm-hmm.
dealing with taboo subjects,
Like what?
bodily functions, sexuality, death.
Okay, so not exactly dinner table conversation.
Probably not. But this type of humor was super popular,
Really?
especially among the lower classes.
Why do you think that was?
Well, I think it was a way to laugh at the things that scared them or disgusted them.
To find humor in the face of adversity.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did this grotesque comedy play out?
Well, think about those carnival festivities we talked about.
Yeah, with the costumes and the masks.
Exactly. People would dress up in these outlandish costumes, often featuring grotesque masks and exaggerated features.
Yeah, those images are wild.
Yeah, and they would engage in all sorts of revelry, mocking authority figures and social norms.
It was like a temporary inversion of the social order.
Exactly. The ugly and absurd were celebrated.
Okay, and then we have the Feast of Fools,
Oh, yes. A step
where
further.
they would actually take over the church.
Yeah, the lower-ranking clergy and commoners would mock the rituals and hierarchies of the church.
It's a pretty bold move.
It was a way to critique the established order.
To point out hypocrisy. And we have a great example of this type of humor in that 15th century poem, The Peasant's Fart,
Crude and graphic.
but with a sharp social critique underneath.
Yeah, it reminds us that even the most ugly things can be used to make a point.
Okay, so let's move on to the Renaissance now.
A time of great change.
Yeah, and we see a shift in attitudes toward ugliness.
The Renaissance saw a rediscovery of classical learning and a renewed interest in humanism.
Okay, so did ugliness just disappear?
Not at all. It was just viewed in a different way.
Okay.
There was a growing acceptance of the grotesque.
But not as something to be feared,
Right, more as a natural part of life and a source of humor and social commentary.
like Rabelais,
Exactly. Gargantua and Pantagruel is a great example.
full of grotesque imagery and satire.
Yeah, but it's not just shock value.
Right.
Rabelais is using the grotesque to critique the church and the aristocracy,
So he's using humor and exaggeration to point out flaws in society.
and to advocate for a more free and open way of thinking.
And we see this shift in Renaissance art too, right?
Absolutely. Artists started to explore the human body with more realism.
So not just idealized beauty.
Right. They were depicting imperfections and flaws.
It's like they were saying, hey, this is what real people look like.
And it's beautiful in its own way.
Yeah, and this embrace of realism paves the way for caricature.
A powerful tool for social commentary.
Yeah, using distortion and exaggeration.
Like Daumier and Gros.
Right, highlighting the flaws of those in power.
Their work was often biting and critical.
It's like they're saying, look, these people may be powerful, but they're not above ridicule.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go back to something we've touched on a few times.
Okay.
The portrayal of ugliness in the female form.
A complex and often problematic issue.
Yeah, those examples from Dante and Shakespeare and the Silver Lady poems.
They really highlighted how ugliness was used to devalue women,
Especially as they aged.
reflecting those societal anxieties about female aging and the pressure to be beautiful.
But thankfully, there were voices of resistance.
Yes, during the Renaissance.
Like those anti-blazon poets.
They challenged those traditional views
Celebrating female beauty on their own terms.
and critiquing the perceived ugliness of men.
It was a powerful rejection of the male gaze.
It was.
And this shift coincides with a broader reassessment of ugliness during the Mannerist and Baroque periods.
Right. A move toward complexity and nuance.
Michelangelo and Griffius reflecting on aging and decay.
Not afraid to confront the less pleasant aspects of life.
And even the devil gets a makeover.
Becoming less about physical ugliness and more about inner darkness.
So the concept of evil itself is evolving.
Becoming more nuanced and psychological.
So we've journeyed from ancient myth to medieval art to the Renaissance,
Exploring how ugliness has been defined and depicted across centuries.
and how its meaning has shifted and evolved.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, but there's one more stop.
Okay.
Ugliness in the modern world. Welcome back to our deep dive into ugliness.
We're in the home stretch now.
We've explored how it's been defined and depicted throughout history.
Right, from ancient Greece to the Renaissance.
But now it's time to bring things into the modern era.
The 20th and 21st century.
Yeah, and I feel like the modern world presents us with like a whole new set of anxieties
Oh, absolutely.
and new forms of ugliness.
Think about all the technology,
Yeah.
the mass media, the constant images.
It's overwhelming.
It really is, and it all affects what we consider beautiful or ugly,
Yeah, we're constantly being told what's beautiful.
especially through advertising
Oh, yeah.
and social media.
And it can make you feel pretty inadequate.
It can lead to a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so how have artists and writers grappled with these modern anxieties in their work?
Well, one way is through that concept of the uncanny that we talked about earlier,
Right, that feeling of unease.
when something is both familiar and disturbing.
Yeah, it feels very relevant to the modern world.
It is. Think about those figures in Ian Fleming's Goldfinger,
Okay.
like Odd Job with his steel-rimmed hat.
Yeah.
He's both human and monstrous.
Yeah, and what about the thing in John W. Campbell Jr.'s story?
Oh, yes, the thing,
It can mimic any life form.
violating our understanding of biology.
Pure nightmare fuel.
It really taps into those primal fears of the unknown.
Yeah, the potential for the familiar to turn monstrous.
Exactly.
So it's like in the modern world, the things that scare us most aren't always like obviously grotesque.
Right.
It's the subtle distortions, the things that make us question what's real.
And this blurring of boundaries, this unease, it's something that modern art and literature have really explored.
Yeah, like the surrealists,
Oh, yes, Stolly McCreate,
dreamlike imagery, distorted figures.
challenging our perceptions of reality.
Yeah, and what about artists like Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud?
Their portraits are often distorted and grotesque.
They're not afraid to show the raw and vulnerable side of humanity.
It's a reminder that beauty isn't always about perfection,
It can be found in the imperfect.
the unconventional.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into ugliness,
Mm.
what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think one of the biggest is that ugliness, like beauty, is subjective.
We've seen that throughout history.
We have what's repulsive to one person might be beautiful to another.
Yeah, like those medieval depictions of hell,
Exactly what was meant to terrify might now seem fascinating,
or even comical.
right? So context is everything.
We need to consider the historical and cultural factors.
And the personal, too.
When we encounter something we find ugly,
It's about being critical of our own reactions.
and trying to understand the meaning behind different depictions of ugliness.
Exactly.
And I think another key takeaway is that ugliness has this power to provoke us,
To challenge us
to make us think critically.
about ourselves and the world.
We've seen how artists and writers have used ugliness to explore all these complex themes.
Mortality, social injustice, the darker sides of human nature.
They forced us to confront the things that make us uncomfortable.
And that can be a good thing,
Yeah, it can help us grow.
to expand our understanding.
So maybe there's a kind of beauty to be found in ugliness.
Maybe by confronting what repels us, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the full range of human experience.
I like that a lot. Okay, so to wrap things up,
Okay.
be open to the unconventional.
Find beauty in unexpected places,
Embrace the full spectrum of human expression.
the beautiful and the ugly.
I love it. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of ugliness.
It's been a fascinating exploration.
It has. We hope you found it insightful and maybe a little bit unsettling.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep an open mind,
The world is full of beauty.
even in the most unexpected places.
Thanks for joining us.